We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we're talking all things legal, from Donald Trump's legal travails to Fourth Amendment issues with squatters across the country. All this and a whole lot more on today's special show. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Donald Trump appears to be in a New York state of mind, with many cases coming out of the Big Apple against him, for him, and everything in between. We're very fortunate to be joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza, who joins us for this special edition examining all things lawfare.
And fellow Billy Joel fan.
And fellow Billy Joel fan, absolutely. I mean, who isn't a Billy Joel fan?
Celebrate the man's whole cat.
Absolutely. Apparently, he does actually ride the New York subway. I read this the other day.
Unlike Mr. Trump, by the way.
Unlike Mr. Trump. He rides the New York subway. And people look at him as though, look at you trying to look all Billy Joel. That's So that's kind of, even though they assume he's not Billy Joel. But anyway, Scott, let's talk New York. So the big news this last week was, on, I believe, Monday last week, was that the bond for Donald Trump's civil case for overinflating his assets, the appeal bond, was reduced from $450+ million down to $175 million, which is, of course, mere pocket change to Mr.
$100 million here, $100 million there.
Between friends, it's almost nothing, right? So that was the big shock there, because Letitia James, the Attorney General, who'd been bringing this case and was the pursuer of these charges, and the presenter of those charges, she was very much all over the media talking about how she's going to seize Trump's assets. And that did not work out well for her, Scott. But I guess what I really want to talk about is where this goes from now, because it may still be the crowning victory for Miss James. It may also be a bit of a win for Donald Trump, depending on how his appeals process goes. What's your initial take on the situation?
Well, I'm going to approach my analysis from somebody who doesn't think that Ms. James looked at facts and applied those facts to the law using her best judgment for how to engage in an economy of effort with her office and the citizens of the state of New York, but instead did whatever she could to, quote unquote, get Donald Trump. Okay.
That's a direct quote from Ms. James in her campaign to.
Indeed. Yeah. And so, from that perspective, I don't know that it's possible that she can do wrong or, quote unquote, lose in a sense, because she's already won by successfully frustrating Donald Trump, getting him to have to spend his time and attention and money on fighting this case, even if he eventually wins. Now, the flip side of that coin is, of course, much like the Fonnie Willis prosecution in Georgia, perhaps it's done more damage to the progressive campaign to cancel Donald Trump than it has to Donald Trump's electoral prospects. So that's all fascinating grist for the mill, I think. But she's far from kind of finished with this process. Mr. Trump, all this does is concern the appeal bond. And I wanted to make sure that we said appeal bond earlier, because people think of a bail bond, for instance, and that's not the case here. And I think we're going to touch on some arguments that might, where Trump might allude that this is an inappropriate fine. But for now, we're just talking about a civil judgment where there's no incarceration possible. And the appeal bond just is, hey, if you've got a judgment against you, the courts have ruled you are liable for a certain amount of money. This is important. This is an important feature of the law, Mark.
Yeah.
If you think about it, if you and I own a widget company and somebody sues us for, producing bad widgets, okay? And
we would never produce bad widgets. I need that out there on the airwaves.
Okay,
the widgets that Scott and I produced they'd be the best widgets ever. People tell me, Mr. President, these are the best widgets.
And we lose at a trial and are held liable for damages for producing bad widgets, and get a substantial award against us, and and it's going to eclipse the value of the widget company. And so we decide, well, that's it. Well, there's a couple ways you can go about it. You could actually do whatever you can to satisfy that judgment and then go out of business. Or we could say, all right, we're going to have a business closing party in Bali for the next month and spend down this money renting Ferraris and private jets. And so the person who won that lawsuit would be denied their judgment because of that, if we were allowed to not post. So that's the purpose of the appeal bond, generally speaking. So anyway, yes, massive reduction. Now they're going to hear the merits of the case. So now there will be a merits claim at the appeals court covering a number of issues, including, I hope, and especially Ms. James' political motivations for her prosecution, as well as other things. And Trump could win or lose there. And then you've got the New York State highest court in the land, and New York State doesn't have the Supreme Court. It's
topsy-turvy, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Supreme Court's the lowest, and
right. Yeah. It's called the Court of Appeals, I think, is their quote unquote Supreme Court. So Trump could win or lose there, and then if he loses, he can go then to federal court. And if the federal court takes the case, then you've got the district court, the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court. So bite and bite and bite and bite and bite at the apple for Mr. Trump to get this, continually reduced.
So the one area I really wanted to discuss on this, and you did touch on it very, very briefly, is that this is a civil case, and it is not a criminal case. However, and it was floating around my mind that the Eighth Amendment, which protects against, let's call it overzealous punishments, right?
Excessive fines.
Excessive
That's the provision
fines.
we're talking about.
Now, we did discuss this before we came on, Scott, to record, but obviously that's only for criminal fines. And
no, let me correct the record, because
Please.
I'm an American lawyer and you're not an American. And
I'm not a lawyer nor an American, right?
On one of those counts, it's to your great credit, I'll say. It does prohibit excessive fines, civil fines that are government levied. And it's hilarious, Mark, because the case on point is the Tibbs case, and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote for the unanimous court in that case. And it's only a 10-year-old case that the excessive fines prohibition contained in the Eighth Amendment has been applied by incorporation to the states. So our Bill of Rights is initially drafted as a prohibition on federal government action. And little by little, there might be one left. Each amendment has been held to protect our rights against state exercise of powers that may infringe on free speech, right to keep and bear arms, search and seizure, etc., and excessive fines. Again, written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I'm laughing because the idea that Trump could win at the Supreme Court based on words that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has written down is just a little extra kind of deliciousness to those of us who, who think that
to everybody, let's be fair. Everybody loves irony, even if it's set against them.
Let me just mention the Tibbs case, some facts about it, because it might be instructive. In that case, the man had a Range Rover. It's really a pocket kind of symphony of understanding of American drug law and seizure law, this case. The guy had a workplace injury, was prescribed opioid pain medication, couldn't get off it, got addicted to it, and got a heroin habit that it developed into. He ran out of money to buy the heroin and then started selling the heroin to fund his own addiction. In that process, his father died, and he used a substantial portion of his inheritance to buy this Land Rover, and he was arrested while delivering some of the drugs with the vehicle. And somehow, according to the police, that entitles them to seize the vehicle. And he argued the maximum fine that he could have been assessed at state law was $10,000, but the vehicle was worth $40,000. And so they've essentially enriched themselves plus $30,000 more than the maximum could be. And the Supreme Court unanimously agreed both that it was excessive and that it was incorporated against the states, that Eighth Amendment protection against excessive fines that Trump is certainly going to argue about here.
So, yeah, it does seem to me that is at least one strand of a possible defense, is that this is a burdensome, excessive fine, disgorgement or fine.
Can I just say one more thing about that?
Sure.
That, because you say disgorgement. So the money judgment that he has to pay was not called a fine. So sometimes courts can assess what are called punitive damages, and just like the name suggests, it is to punish. But the bulk of the money here is in this disgorgement, which is the idea that if Donald Trump didn't misrepresent his financial picture to certain banks, then instead of lending him money at a rate of X, it would be a rate of X plus some amount. And then that's how they calculated all the money that they would owe. Now, there's no credit given, by the way, to the idea that Donald Trump could have negotiated for a different rate, or maybe not even borrowed it at all. That's not included in this calculus.
And it is worth pointing out that the banks who were allegedly defrauded here actually sought to do continued business with Donald Trump after that. Apparently,
as I wrote,
he was a whale, was the term that I heard.
As I wrote, I think in my piece on this our piece on this for LibertyNation.com, they are the most experienced mortgage bankers in the world and far more experienced and sophisticated at mortgage banking than Donald J. Trump is or was. And they called them, loans they wished, good loans, they wanted to engage in them and wished for more loans from Mr. Trump. So
this is the appeals process on this. I think unless it gets overturned at the first hurdle, I think we're in for a good long couple of years until there's a final decision on this. Does that sound about right?
I think Ms. James is going to be in office for a good while longer, so she can her and the Soros checkbook that's funding her crusades. As long as that keeps up, then yes, I suppose you're right.
We'll be back talking about New York, continuing Donald Trump's travails in the great state after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.